Welcome to the We Got It podcast,
a Michigan State sports podcast for everyone.
We're Jonah and Abby, a husband and wife who's probably a little too obsessed with Spartan sports.
And we want to share a little bit of that obsession with you, from casual fans
to die-hard bleed green fanatics.
And we want to make following Spartan sports easy, enjoyable, and engaging for everyone.
Go green! Well, We Got It listeners, we have a very special We Got It covered segment for you today. We are joined by Dr. Green and White of Spartans Illustrated, Mr. Paul Fanson himself, and he has got lots of hopefully great information, hot takes about the bracket that just released today. So, Paul, we're just going to turn it over to you. Hit us with what your immediate reaction is coming off of the selection show.
Well, in general, it was very positive. I was kind of pleasantly surprised by a few different aspects of the bracket. The committee did a lot of questionable things, I think, but they always do. So you just have to kind of expect that.
Yes.
As far as the overall bracket, how the number one seeds were arranged was kind of the same thing people have been thinking for like 2 or 3 weeks. And I think things have changed in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but the committee didn't seem to get the memo. So that was a little odd. I think Florida probably earned the right to be a little bit higher than the lowest of the one seeds. And then I've been kind of preaching this all week, that Houston should be in the West. Like, there's no excuse to put Houston in the Midwest. That was just a mistake, and I don't know why they did that. So that just kind of was a little irritating, because I expect to be disappointed from the committee, but
Yes.
One of these years I expect them to make the right decisions, and they just seem to not most of the time. But then as I looked at the bracket, because over the last week or so, I've been thinking it'd be better for Michigan State to draw Florida in the Midwest. That would be kind of an ideal placement. But the more and more I think about it, and as the SEC tournament rolled on, and Florida, was able to get to the final and win, Tennessee upset Auburn. And then you look at Auburn's lost 3 of 4, and you're like, maybe even though Auburn's the number one overall seed, are they still the number one team in the country?
Yeah.
Right.
And they've fallen to number 4 in KenPom, which is a system that I rely on pretty heavily to make predictions. And so, being in the South with Auburn is not a bad draw. And so if you just look at the high end part of the bracket, the top 2 seeds, that's actually, I think, the softest of the one seeds as it appears now that MSU could have gotten. So I think that's very good. And then when I saw the 3 seed, it's Iowa State, my jaw dropped a little bit, because I thought that was a very generous placement for Iowa State. I had them as a 4 seed. I thought MSU was going to draw Kentucky or Texas A&M almost certainly, and that didn't happen. But the strange thing is that Iowa State also is pretty loved by KenPom, so that kind of makes me wonder a little bit if maybe they're just a little bit better than I thought. But I'm not mad at that placement. And then Marquette, I think, is a potential 7-seed matchup. I'm not really terribly scared of them. New Mexico sitting there at the 10. They're another potential opponent there in the second round. The Mountain West, historically, sometimes they look like they're going to be good, but then they're really not. So honestly, I think this bracket opens up pretty well potentially for Michigan State to at least get to that regional final. And then against Auburn, right now, based on KenPom, it looks like they would only be about a 5-point underdog to Auburn.
Okay,
wow.
I think reasonable.
I think we would take that.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I went through and updated all my numbers, and I give MSU, I think it's about a 16% chance to get to the Final Four. Yep, 1 in 6. That's what it looks like right now. So I think
as a fan,
that's
I
good.
wish it was a little higher, but I love that the numbers are supporting Michigan State that much, especially when you do think about, part of me initially emotionally reacting to that region, especially because it's the first one that they revealed. You're like, these are a lot of incredible teams that are stacking up. But then the bracket keeps going, and you just realize the depth that is in college basketball this year is just pretty phenomenal. And there's going to be some fantastic first-round matchups. So, yeah, when you think about the whole and you think about the other teams that have shaken out, and like you said, like Iowa State going higher than maybe some people would have predicted them to, it's pretty favorable for Michigan State when it comes to that.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
I know you mentioned if that Elite Eight matchup was Michigan State Auburn, Auburn would be like 5.5-point favorites.
That's what it looks
As
like.
far
Yep.
as other matchups, I'd assume that Michigan State would probably be favored in any other matchup to the Elite Eight.
Yes, it looks like MSU is the second highest Ken Palm team in the region, and Ken Palm numbers, why I like them so much is because they correlate to point spreads very well. And point spreads, frankly, correlate to real results. So when they say they're predictive measurements, that is real. They do often, from a probability standpoint, predict what is most likely to happen. But I mean, so the analysis that I do, the way I like to explain it is that I can tell you how the dice are loaded, but you still got to roll the dice. So, things can happen. But yeah, as far as that, I guess we should talk about the first round opponent, which is Bryant.
Yeah, great.
I don't know much about them. It looks like MSU is projected about a 19-point favorite, which is a little higher than usual for a 215. Usually it's around a little more closer to 15. The odds will tell you that the 2 seed should win 95% of the time. And if you actually go back in the history of the NCAA tournament, 2 seeds win about 95% of the time. So that checks out. But MSU's odds are closer to 97. So that's of course, there's still that 3% chance. We don't want to talk about that, but it's a pretty good draw.
We don't need another unnameable team from Tennessee.
No. Right. And I hate to admit this, but I had my eye on that team in their conference tournament, and when they lost, I did sigh a little bit of a little bit of relief.
There's still some PTSD.
Yeah, absolutely. Years and years later, for sure.
But here's a really weird this is how deep in the weeds I get. When MSU drew Bryant, it sort of raised my eyebrows, and it's for a really stupid reason, because Bryant is located in Rhode Island. I didn't even know where the school was located. I believe they're out of the American East. So one of the regions, or one of the first round sites, is in Providence, which is the school is in the suburbs of Providence, and that would have lined them up to play St. John's. So why didn't they just let them play closer to home and play St. John's? Like, did they really think that Bryant would have this huge home crowd advantage that would scare Rick Pitino? I think that's weird. But instead, they sent them to Cleveland, where they could have and should have sent Omaha, frankly, Fiddler's old team, to Cleveland to play the Spartans, which would have frankly been more fun.
Yeah, right before they revealed the 15 seed, Jonah goes, all right, are we going to see Frankie Fiddler's old team here? But yeah, that's a really interesting thing to think about. Are they that scared of the quote-unquote home court advantage in Providence? That's very interesting.
It does seem like the committee oftentimes likes to kind of put those storylines, especially to make some of these first-round matchups more interesting. And St. John's versus Bryant and Michigan State versus Omaha definitely would have been two more interesting matchups on paper to kind of get those people to be interested in a game that might not be on top of people's radar around
kind of pull those heartstrings a little bit. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, that just seems like a miss by the committee, one of many. But as far as
so many every year.
So many.
I think Paul and I are very aligned on this. I have just a general distaste. I mean, probably most people do, for the NCAA selection committee. So I'm glad that we're aligned on that.
It's just odd decisions. Now, as far as MSU's potential path, I would have them as about a 4-point favorite over Marquette, which that seems slightly tight for a 2-7. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, as you mentioned, if you compare this season to past seasons, the top 8 or 10 seeds are all much stronger than usual. And I don't know if that's real or if there's some sort of weird, because they all play each other. So there's some amount of interconnectedness that could be just causing weird problems. But at least my initial analysis was the first round could be pretty quiet in general, not many upsets, but then the second round could be more active as far as upsets. So
I think too, looking at that 7-10 potential matchup, not having to face against Kansas or even I think is Missouri a 7 seed as well?
I
think
6.
I think you might.
Kansas or St. Mary's too, who won the West Coast Conference. I think from that regard, Michigan State's probably feeling fortunate to play Marquette. Not that Marquette isn't capable of beating Michigan State, but when looking at some of these other teams that have won a lot of games, might be a little more scary on paper. I think I was looking at Marquette on Ken Palm, and they're a pretty poor rebounding team. And Michigan State obviously is super strong, rebounding the ball. So I think that could be a potential mismatch. And I think, too, Michigan State, this isn't necessarily based on any data, but Marquette with Cam Jones, one of the best players in the country, prolific scorer. I think Michigan State actually matches up well against teams that are really leaning on one singular guy, especially because they can just throw so many different guards at them. So especially like in Cleveland, like with this pod, like I think Michigan State got a pretty favorable draw without looking at the rest of the bracket.
And thinking about the second round too, it's obviously not a guarantee that Michigan State could potentially face Marquette. I mean, you got Richard Pitino, who we could potentially be facing down in that second round. What are your thoughts on that, Paul?
Oh, that's a good call. I forgot he was at New Mexico.
Yeah.
That'd be kind of fun. Yeah, I mean, Marquette, they do, as I look at this, do seem to be the weakest of the 7 seeds based on Ken Palm. New Mexico is the second strongest 10 seed. So
interesting.
That would be interesting. I mean, and then the other part, which I don't know if you guys I'm sure you remember, but was it 2 years ago or 3 years ago that MSU faced Marquette in the second round? But Marquette was the 2.
The roles were reversed. Yeah, we were talking about that prior to this.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that we'll see how that comes out. But yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about that matchup. I mean, after all, MSU should be able to get by Marquette. I mean, they really should. I mean, Marquette is well, I mean, they're fairly similar to UCLA. Well, so maybe that's not a great example. Also, Oregon or Michigan.
Well,
so
after the way UCLA looked in the Big Ten tournament, maybe that's an okay thing.
Yeah,
true.
It's a good point. So that's kind of the peer group as far as Ken Palm goes would suggest. So I'd feel pretty good about that. Now, Iowa State is interesting because actually their metrics actually look pretty good. Like they're actually, I think, the strongest 3 seed perhaps. Yeah. Well, no, Texas Tech is a little better. So they're the second strongest 3 seed. Actually, Kentucky on paper would have been the easiest draw, which is who I honestly thought they were going to get.
Yeah.
But I feel like Iowa State kind of stumbled down the stretch a little bit.
They did. I know they finished 7-7 in their last 14 games. And they just announced, too, that their second leading scorer, leader in assists and minutes per game, is going to be out for the tournament, too. Wow. So I think that's a pretty significant loss for Iowa State. So I even thinking, like, for their potential matchup against Ole Miss, like, I wouldn't even be surprised if Michigan State were to get to the Sweet 16 if Iowa State isn't even the team they're matched up against.
Very interesting.
Now, Ole Miss is interesting because I believe that their coach is the former Texas Tech coach, whose name is escaping me, who MSU faced in the 19 Final Four. Yeah. Chris Beard. There we go. Thank you, Jonah. Yeah, that's...
Oof, I don't want to face him again.
No, I don't either. He's a good coach.
Yes, he is.
He's had some weird personal problems, but he's a good coach. So that would be a potential interesting matchup to watch out for there in the Sweet 16.
Right.
It would shock me.
I mean, his MO, especially, I mean, that Texas Tech team is that pack line, high pressure defense that gave Michigan State a lot of fits in the Final Four. Yep. And I think if that was a matchup, I think that would be an absolute dogfight. Offense is going to be tough to come by, especially to, like you said, a coach that's been there before, has gotten the best of Michigan State.
I'm feeling more and more as we talk about this that I want to face Iowa State when we get there.
Yeah. I was trying to look up what my projected spread would be for that game.
And so, Paul, when you talk about things being on paper, a lot of this you're looking at those predictive analytics, correct?
Yes.
I know you said you prefer Ken Palm. Okay. So less so looking at the past, resume of teams that they've beaten. I know that gets thrown around a lot at Selection Sunday, but more looking at those kind of predictive measures.
No, it's more just the raw numbers and looking for kind of, historically weak teams versus historically strong teams and seeing where there might be, advantages or disadvantages. I do have Michigan State as a 4-point favorite over Mississippi, over Ole Miss.
Okay.
So yeah, I think...
Which is interesting because Mississippi is the 8 seed, Marquette's the 7 seed, and that spread's a little bit smaller in a potential matchup against Ole Miss.
Yep, that happens sometimes.
Well, and I think that speaks to, you and I spent some time this weekend down at the Big Ten tournament talking about how that line between seeds is oftentimes, I think, a lot blurrier than people sitting at home on their couches wants to believe, right? We think of it as these lines drawn in the sand, like this is where the 5 seed sits, and then way below them is where the top 6 seed sits. Versus, actually, there might be a lot more, and you probably can say it better. There can be a lot more disparity between, the top number 5 seed and the bottom number 5 seed than there is between the bottom number 5 seed and the top number 6 seed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes teams just get sort of placed in kind of funky positions, and so as I was looking through some of the some of the places that some of the teams were seated, you can see some of the teams kind of stand out, and some of the ones that do, like Gonzaga is a great example. They're an 8th seed in the Midwest, but their KenPom has been very strong all year. And I have them as I had them as like a 5 seed, I think. And that's a potentially dangerous matchup for Houston in that second round. Gonzaga's got a track record, and, that could be one to watch for as, problematic. It's definitely going to be a tighter spread than a usual 1-8. And that's the kind of advantage that I'd like to look at.
Yeah. And we were even just chatting about Louisville too. Just thinking they've got really underseeded, and they're playing in Lexington, if I'm not mistaken. Correct? Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was crazy. That was the weirdest seed of the when that came up, and it came up early as an 8. I was like, wait a minute, what?
Yes.
That was shocking. And
for Auburn potentially having to play a road game at Louisville round 2, that's a tough draw for the number 1 overall seed.
Yeah, absolutely. In theory, Auburn is, strong, but that could be a problem.
More of a challenge than they're hoping to face that early on in the tournament.
Absolutely. Yeah. One thing I did want to bring up at this point is kind of thinking especially of Michigan State's region. What are your initial thoughts of the Wolverines being that 5 seed up top?
I was just about to mention our friends, the Wolverines. I do think a 5 seed was appropriate. It was, I actually had them as a 5 seed. Being that they did beat Wisconsin today somehow, I don't know how, didn't watch it. I would have, if I really been strict about my metrics that I used to seed the teams, that would have actually bumped them up to a 4 seed. But A, that doesn't matter. A 4 and a 5 really doesn't matter. And B, there's no time to make that change. So, I think a 5 seed was a good placement for them. But I agree that UC San Diego team is dangerous, and I think that game's played in Denver, right? So they shipped Michigan out to play in Denver on Thursday against a West Coast team.
After playing 3 games in 3 days,
a rough turnaround.
That could be tough, and I don't know much about UC San Diego, but I think it was my good friend Seth Davis that threw out that he was going to make that upset pick on the broadcast, and I'm looking at that. Honestly, as I look at those 5-12s, yep, that is one of my upset picks, or it should be.
I don't know if Seth Davis has ever said something that made me quite so happy right off the gate in the selection show.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly where I saw it, but I believe UC San Diego was 36th in KenPom.
Yeah, they're a pretty legit team.
I think what I saw too is that's the highest rated 12 seed ever on KenPom going into the tournament, which is saying a lot, I think.
Yeah. I'd have to go back and check that, but yeah, you're correct. They're 36. So,
and I know something that you mentioned too is you always love to take a 30 win, high seed team, and they're 30-4. They've got a lot of things going well for them in that first round.
Yeah, they're a team that's won a lot. They were even too in the conversation of being an at-large team if they didn't win their conference tournament. So
they should have been.
That says a lot when you're coming from
playing well this weekend, but definitely not a great draw to see that compared to some maybe the other 12 seeds that would have been significantly weaker according to some of these measures that we're looking at.
Yeah. I also like the other team that seems drastically overseeded is Memphis as a 5. I actually have them as an underdog to Colorado State. So
I love it.
We'll see how that's a 5-12. So that's another one to look out for.
Yeah.
And the VCU is also a potentially dangerous team. It looks like they got matched up with BYU in a 6-11 game, and VCU has also been strong at KenPom. So that's another team that I could see pulling an upset. Those are the ones that stand out, and those first weekend games just based on those pairings.
maybe this is just recency bias or, what your brain tends to hold on to, but those, 11-6 and 5-12 upsets happen pretty frequently.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any of the numbers on that, Paul, or have any, when you think about filling out your own brackets, I'm sure you've got spreadsheets that you're pulling up when you're doing that.
Yes.
But, do you take so many 12 seeds over 5 seeds or so many 11 seeds over 6 seeds, or is it really coming down to the individual teams? Does that make sense?
It does, yes. No, I can tell you exactly what the statistics are because I'm looking at them right now.
Fantastic. I knew you'd have it.
Yeah, I mean, it's it looks like a 5-12 upset happens about 68% of the time, or the 5 seed would win 68% of the time. So it's about a third. So 1/3 of all 5-12 games in an upset, and 40% of 6-11 games are upsets.
Wow.
So
interesting.
Yeah, almost
so
half.
When you're filling out your bracket, you should be taking at least one 12 seed over a 5 and maybe even 2 11s over 6. But the key point is always picking the
right one.
Right.
And I always seem to have a knack for not doing that.
Well, and that's exactly the strategy that I use, is that I can tell you, roughly how many upsets there'll be in the first round, and so you can sort of get a feel. And if you, again, essentially what I do is I look at KenPom, and you look at a team that's relatively strong for its seed versus a team that's relatively weak for its seed, and that's a more likely upset. And so, like for Michigan and UC San Diego, that's going to be a tighter spread than usual, as is Memphis, Colorado State. So those are the most likely upsets. And I just look at those relative to the historical averages for more or less likely, and it doesn't always work, but it usually works reasonably well.
Right.
You're making these complex mathematical terms seem like something that I can actually comprehend.
That's
and do
great.
At home. So thank you. I really appreciate that.
That's what I try to do. I don't know if I always do it well, but that is, trying to explain complicated things in an understandable way is something I try to do.
I love it.
One thing I thought would be interesting kind of to talk about a little bit is thinking of some of those last 4 teams in versus first 4
I
teams.
absolutely wanted to talk to Paul about
especially
this.
too, just seeing 13 SEC teams versus
14.
14, you're
14
right.
SEC teams.
Versus 8 Big Ten teams. And again, this isn't based on numbers, but I have a hard time thinking there's 14 teams in the SEC that are better than, say, Indiana from the Big Ten who missed the tournament.
Or Ohio State. And how you've got 2 Big Ten teams who are on the first 4 out.
Yeah.
And you've got teams from SEC, ACC that are getting in over those teams.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, strangely enough, I actually had North Carolina safely in the tournament, which even I couldn't figure out how that worked. But I put that out there, and people were like, "Oh no, Carolina's not going to make that." And I'm like, "Well, maybe they won't." It's one quad one win, that doesn't seem great.
Right.
But I felt somewhat vindicated that my original numbers, even though I changed them, had them in. I had most of the first 4 correct. I had, I think, San Diego State. Xavier. I did have Indiana in. I think they were my last team in. Texas was the team that really stuck out to me as being not deserving of a bid. I mean, they're 19-15. I don't know if a 15-loss team has ever made the tournament, and they got 5 losses outside of quad 1. 5. That's too many.
Yeah.
I have their strength of record as 57. That's not good. What are they good at? What was the selling point for Texas? I don't see it. Their KenPom's 44. It's really, I don't get it. Yes, they are now.
That's their selling point.
Sure, it just means more. It just means more.
You bring that up about Texas having 5 losses outside of quad 1 versus a team like Indiana who has 0 losses outside of quad 1.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously get victories against Michigan State, victories against Purdue. And then, you look at teams like Texas with those many losses, 6-12 in the SEC, losses. UNC with 1 quad 1 victory. Yeah, I think it's just hard, especially too when you have the selection committee chair who's also the athletic director at North Carolina making the defense for these last 4 teams. And it just it feels a little off to me.
I have to bring this up because it had to have been a Freudian slip or something, but this man, the AD for North Carolina, is on TV talking about how, people are going to complain that there's so many SEC teams matching up against each other. So like early on in the tournament or, within regions, they've got all these SEC teams. And he goes, with 14 SEC teams, it's really hard to fit them all in. And then kind of pauses and then follows up with like, according to all the rules and regulations, because there's 14 teams, that's why they're going to play each other so often. I'm like, yeah, it is really interesting how hard it is to fit 14 SEC teams in. Like, it was just so interesting to me how he worded that sentence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it just means more, I guess. I don't know.
So
I guess we'll see the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. After looking at Michigan State's region, kind of looking at maybe some of the other potential upsets, as people are filling out their brackets in the coming days, are there any other like advice you would give, or maybe principles to follow as they're trying to decide Elite Eights, Final Fours, upsets, anything like that?
And I'm going to put a disclaimer out here that none of our listeners are allowed to hold Dr. Green and White personally responsible if your bracket doesn't do well.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because using the methodology that I use, like sometimes it works really, really well. Like I picked UConn to win the title 2 years ago, like before they, the first of the two, and they were just a 4 seed. So
yeah,
I was in like the 99.9th percentile on my ESPN bracket that year. But then a few years before that, I was looking at it and I was like, oh yeah, this number 2 seed Kentucky, they're gonna make the final. They're gonna beat Kansas in the championship game. And unfortunately, they had that St. Peter's game, that first one that we all thought they were gonna win. So that didn't go well for me.
Doug Eder and the Peacocks.
Oh, the Peacocks.
Yeah.
My brother-in-law, poor Chris, he's a big old Kentucky fan, and he is still haunted by the Peacocks and his nightmares.
Yeah. Well, that's understandable.
Yes, it is.
But the other thing sort of an interesting thing to look at is when you pick Final Four teams, there's kind of a general rule of thumb that a lot of people don't realize, because when people make the selections like on the CBS show or the ESPN show, it'll be like 3 1 seeds and a 2 seed. They're going to be their Final Four.
Yes, and we were just mocking them, quite honestly, for that. There were 2 guys back to back that had all 4 1 seeds in the Final Four. I was like, wow,
that's happened once in history, and it's not going to happen this year.
No,
it's not. It may be more likely than some years, but I bet it still doesn't happen.
It's only happened once.
One time in history.
Wow.
There's been more Final Fours with no 1 seeds at all than there have been with all 1 seeds.
Wow.
Is that the 2008 tournament that all 4 1 seeds were in?
I believe that is correct, yes. I can tell you in a second. Yes, 2008 is correct.
Me too. I can't keep up.
That's why
I remember that year because Michigan State ended up playing one of those 1 seeds, Memphis and Derrick Rose, and just ran into an absolute buzzsaw in that game. Drew Neitzel's senior season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as far as years with no 1 seeds, I see 2023, I see 2011, I see 2006.
Wow.
And so those 3 times it's happened in history. So
don't listen to the CBS selection show, guys. It's just it's not worth it.
And generally a good rule of thumb, like there's almost always one that makes it, and 1 or 2. So 2 1 seeds, that makes sense. But like your 3rd best seed, probably not a 1. It's probably going to be like a 2 or a 3. That's a good rule of thumb. So it's like a 1, a 2, and a 2, or a 1, a 2, and a 3, something like that. But then the lowest seed in the Final Four, like the average, is something like 4.5 or something crazy like that.
Interesting.
Or 6. So like there's almost always one random team that makes it through. I mean, over the last 10 years or so, the lowest seed in the Final Four has been 11, 9, 8, 11, 5, 11, 7, 10, 7, 8, 9, 4, 11, 5.
Wow.
Going back to 2010.
That's a lot of 11s I just heard you say.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, 4 times an 11 seed.
That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, so, I mean, it happens, and it happens almost every year. So when you make it, but I mean, again, which one's it going to be? I don't know.
Yes. Yeah.
But
yeah.
So I usually try to make my bracket mimic statistically what the actual bracket probably will be, but that's not necessarily a good strategy, but it's a fun one. So that's what I'm going to do.
Right. Because again, you might have an 11 seed making the Elite Eight, but if you pick the wrong one, it doesn't do you any good.
Exactly.
But it always infinitely more fun to be able to pull for some of those underdogs. I guarantee you, those of you who are out there picking upsets are going to have so much more fun than Seth Davis or whoever the heck is throwing all 1s and 2 seeds in their Final Four.
Those guys are boring.
Yes.
I struggle with that too, because a lot of times I want my bracket to do so well, almost to the point where especially if I have a team going really far, I root against that upset instead of rooting for that fun upset, and kind of disappointed if that 15 or 14 wins in the first weekend. But yeah, I think like you said, it's more fun when those teams win and people enjoy it more, and there's more of those one shiny moments.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you hate to root against the underdog just for your bracket. It just a part of me, I do that sometimes too, and a part of me inside dies a little bit when I'm forced to do that.
Right. Well, that was a lot of really helpful information, especially kind of breaking down specifically Michigan State's region, kind of other seeds and teams across the bracket. Any final words or thoughts that you might have that you want to share with us?
I was just looking at one other set of numbers, which I thought was interesting, is I have a way to estimate the level of difficulty of each region, and I can rank them for you.
Interesting. That's fantastic.
I can tell you how I do it here in a second. But the easiest bracket is actually the South, which is nice for us.
Interesting.
The West is only slightly easier. The Midwest is then the third easiest, and then the East is grading out as the hardest bracket.
Okay.
And that's the way I basically calculate that is that's if you take a random reference team that's like a top 25 team, it's sort of like that wins above the bubble team, like an average, and you sort of have them, what are the odds for that team to make the Final Four from all 16 positions? And I can make that calculation, and so then it's like this averaged probability that an average team could make the Final Four. And so in this, if that random reference team were placed in the South, they'd have the easiest overall path to make the Final Four.
Gotcha. I like that.
That is very helpful. As soon as you brought that up, I was thinking, I wonder if this is similar to wins above bubbles.
Right. Exactly. It's a very similar concept.
If you're just trying to pick that Cinderella team, maybe that lower seed could be an option to go with a team out of the South because if that kind of seems like maybe the generalist or general most easy path. I don't know.
Except for the fact that ultimately they're going to meet up with Michigan State.
Right, so it's not going to matter. Yeah. So don't pick a Cinderella out of the South.
No, the 2 seed there looks really good, so I would just leave that alone.
Absolutely.
Well, Paul, as we've been talking about upsets, I think I want to close out by asking you, I don't know if you even started working on your bracket yet. I'm sure the wheels have started turning as soon as the selection show came out.
Yeah.
But what is maybe an upset that you are eyeballing, one that you're really excited about, or for sure, yes, I'm taking this upset, maybe other than UC San Diego?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the one that I'm looking straight at right now. I'm like,
I think we all were as soon as that came
my 12-seeded friends. I don't know if I have another good one. I mentioned Colorado State over Memphis.
Ooh, yeah.
I kind of like Liberty over Oregon, too, although Oregon gets to play in Seattle. Oregon gets to play in Seattle?
You're speaking Jonah's language over here.
How did they put Oregon in Seattle, but they sent Wisconsin to Denver when they could have put them in Milwaukee? Again.
And they also sent Maryland to Seattle. Poor Maryland.
Well,
that's a rough draw for them.
Yeah.
Right. Traveling clear across the other side of the country.
Hey, but thanks to the Big Ten, they're used to it now. So
yeah, they could have put Purdue in Seattle and sent Maryland. They could have put Maryland in Rhode Island, and they could have put Purdue in Seattle. And Maryland had a better season than Purdue. So let's be honest. What are we doing here, committee? What are we even doing?
No one knows.
No one knows.
I think that is the main thing that we have learned out of this segment.
Wow, I didn't even realize that till now. But no, I guess other than those 5-12s that I'm mentioning, and that's far too many. That's maybe too optimistic for the 12s. But I'd have to think about that. I need to let the bracket marinate in my brain for a day or two. I usually don't make my picks till Tuesday.
Okay.
I'm going to take the UC San Diego one. That's a fantastic upset.
Right. Put it in ink.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think all three of us are going to have that upset.
It's going to be.
Quite honestly, I don't think it would have mattered who you put in that 12 line. I probably was going to be thinking that upset just out of pure pettiness. Well, Dr. Green and White, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to sit down and talk bracketology with us. I hope it's really helped our listeners. Sounds like Ken Pom is kind of the way to go. You also have Bart Torvik. There's, different predictive analytics that you can sit down if you really wanted to take your bracket to the next level. And I'm sure, Paul, you're going to be having some fantastic content out on Spartans Illustrated this week as well to help guide that. I
traditionally do sometimes a 2-part series on all of my picks and the methodology, the thought process for making them. So
fantastic.
I'll start putting that together now.
If you want Paul's level of knowledge, definitely be sure to head over to Spartans Illustrated this week and check out those articles. You aren't going to want to miss them. It's time for your weekly halftime check-in. And while we are on the topic of March Madness, we want you to know that not only are just the men kicking off NCAA March Madness this week, but the women's basketball teams are as well. Slightly adjusted schedule from Friday to Monday. So when you hit the end of Sunday, we wake up Monday and you're like, no, the weekend of basketball is over. It's not. You got so many great women's games coming on Monday too. And your Lady Spartans have just been announced as the 7 seed going up against the 10 seed Harvard. Time is still TBD. They are 75% win favorites in that matchup. And then if they win, they would most likely take on the 2 seed NC State, who will be hosting those first 2 rounds, the round of 64, the round of 32. So we know that the men's team now is going to be playing Friday night at 10 p.m. Be sure to keep an eye out for when the women's Spartans play. Really hoping they're not playing in that same time, so that you can check out that game as well.
Moving over to men's hockey, their season continues to roll on as Michigan State defeated Notre Dame at Mount Ice Arena 1-0 on Saturday night to advance to their second consecutive Big Ten tournament championship, also hosting at MUN. So Michigan State will face off against Ohio State on Saturday night.
That.
I know if you're like us last year, we had 5 TVs on Saturday night, 4 for basketball, 1 for men's hockey. And Michigan State's looking for not only back-to-back Big Ten regular season championships, but back-to-back Big Ten tournament champions and the likely number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. So I'm excited. Playoff hockey is one of the most fun things.
Electric.
Was actually getting a lot of our attention over March Madness last year, which is saying a lot.
A lot.
So definitely it's going to be a busy weekend. High stakes for men's basketball, women's basketball, and hockey.
Yeah, we might need 6 TVs depending on when the women's team is playing.
But tune in. Michigan State is playing in the postseason. It's always fun.
Absolutely. Just continuing to dominate March, and I can't wait for more.
All right, guys. Well, hopefully you enjoyed our segment with Paul Fanson, Dr. Greenway, kind of breaking down the bracket, Michigan State's chance of getting out of the South region and going to a Final Four and against some possible opponents, what those might look like. And we talked about how there's a lot going on this weekend in Spartan athletics across the board. But we wanted to kind of just end the podcast, kind of just talking about maybe some things we learned from the Big Ten tournament that can maybe carry over into the NCAA tournament this next weekend, because even though Michigan State didn't have the result they wanted, I think there's still some things that we can talk about as far as what this team is and what this team maybe needs to improve on or continue to do well in order to find that March success.
This is our way of having to talk about a loss without having to talk about a loss. No, just kidding. I mean, honestly, Big Ten tournament, just such a fun experience for us getting to be down there. We would have absolutely loved to be able to stay on Sunday and continue to see our guys advance. And as the logical, the emotional side of me got a grip on things and the logical side started coming out more. There's a lot of things that losing on Saturday, no one wants to lose. We want to keep stacking up the wins. I'm not ever going to say we would have rather lost that game than won.
No,
never.
Foolishness.
But there are things coming out of, hey, if we are going to lose this game, there are things that we can take with us. One of those being we stayed injury-free. And I think, quite honestly, that might be the most important thing to come out of Big Ten tournament weekend for us, that tournament really means nothing. If we are able to win it and add that to our resume, add that to all the things that we did this season, fantastic. Right. But there's nothing actually truly on the line for Michigan State. I think now that the selection has come out, I don't think if we had won that tournament, that would have put us anywhere close to getting a 1 seed. That selection is set for a long time. And so I think the biggest thing of being able to, especially after that Oregon game when Jace got absolutely pummeled, being able to come out of that weekend truly injury-free is a huge win, in my opinion.
I think that's massive, especially like with this team's depth, be able to have all 10 of those guys healthy. I think we might see some different lineups and minute distributions for the NCAA tournament. But
dear goodness, I hope so.
Tom Izzo has all the options available to him for whatever he deems best.
He can do what he wants
this weekend. So I think, like you said, that's key. That was my number one thing is like, obviously we want to win. We wish we would have won. But number one, stay healthy, success.
Yes, absolutely.
I think for me, another thing that I would say is kind of right below that is the play of Jeremy Fears.
Yes.
He's a guy that I think we've been hard on maybe a little bit this year. Fans have been hard on. He has seemed like be rushed at times, not making the best decisions all the time, being
the
very
month of February was pretty rough for
timid
him.
Offensively. And I think what we saw from Jeremy this weekend was a lot more confident, a lot more decisive, somebody who's trying to get to the hoop, not just settling for jumpers. And I think that level of play from him is a good sign for Michigan State heading into this next weekend.
And it's not just us that think that. I mean, Tom was pretty emphatic about that both after the Oregon win and after the Wisconsin loss, was that the level of play from Jeremy Fears Jr. was just elevated. Those last 2 games and really the last 4 or 5, it's been so encouraging, even in the loss against Wisconsin, to see him just be so decisive and take things to the hoop. I feel like so many of his layups, he should have been getting an extra point at the charity line with. But he still powered through. And the bigger thing than that is that he made the basket. He was actually going up strong. And just seeing that level of confidence and grit and tenacity from him was very encouraging. Because when he is more of a threat from multiple levels of the court, it again, especially from your floor general, from your point guard, is going to open up so many more options for everyone else on offense.
Yeah, I think he's just the guy that we talked about. Missed most of last year. It kind of has taken them a little bit to get kind of back into the swing of things. He's still considered a freshman.
Yeah.
And we kind of see now, hey, maybe he's kind of more now that sophomore level player. He's got those games under his belt. He's got that confidence. And I think he's just kind of figuring out himself, and figuring out that, hey, no, I can get to the hoop. I can lead this team. I can be the point guard. And I'm really excited. I think guard depth, guard play is so important in March Madness. And you have your point guard playing at a high level, that bodes well for your team going into the tournament.
Yeah. And this might be me reading into things a little bit too much, but at the Big Ten tournament with the post-game press conferences, they brought 2 players out from each team to talk as well, which is something that you don't often see just during the regular season. You're just going to have the coaches doing the press conference afterwards. And I thought it was very interesting that after the Wisconsin loss, Tom chose to bring out his 2 freshmen to represent the team.
Yeah.
Redshirt freshman Jeremy Fears and then Jace Richardson. And I think that says a lot. Like, part of me as a coach would almost want to put my veteran players out there who, have been around the media more, who kind of know how to handle loss maybe a little bit more. But he chose to bring his freshmen out. And I was just really impressed with how they talked about the loss. They weren't satisfied with it by any means. They wanted to go out and win that tournament. But there was also no panic from Jeremy. There was no panic from Jace. It was just really good self-awareness of like, we didn't do the little things today. Now we know what we need to do for next week. Now we know what to clean up, what to tighten up. And it was just a really encouraging, like, we're not satisfied, but we know what to do to be satisfied. And that's to make a very deep run in March.
Yeah, and I think they have the makeup to do it. I think another point that I want to bring up is the moniker a lot for this season has been strength in numbers.
Yeah.
And that has been very true for Michigan State this year. I think in that Wisconsin game particularly, we maybe learned that some of those numbers might not always be strengths. and that there's kind of a drop off if a certain couple of players miss significant minutes in the game. I know Jackson Kohler and Jace Richardson were both in foul trouble against Wisconsin, and those moments when they were off the court is when really Wisconsin was able to flip that game. Thinking about Kohler picking up his second foul with 10 minutes left in the second half. Before that, Michigan State kind of jumped out to a 9-point lead early and kind of looked like the better team in control. And then that's when Wisconsin flipped it when Kohler came out. And then with Richardson getting fouls 2 and 3 right in the first minute of the second half, kind of stifled any chance I think Michigan State had to kind of go on a quick run to start the second half. And I think what I learned from that Wisconsin loss is I think that Jackson Kohler and Jace Richardson are probably the two most important players on this team, just with the elite rebounding that Kohler provides, the heart, the hustle, the grit, and then everything that we already know that Jace provides for this team. And it's going to be paramount that those guys are going to be on the court as much as possible these next couple of weeks.
And I would argue along with that not only can we not have long periods where Kohler isn't, but we can't have long periods where Cooper isn't in the game as well. I think it was in those stretches where not only was Kohler out, but Cooper as well, because he's not being able to get the breather from Jackson. Those are the moments when we really struggled. And we're trying to put this, I think, in a nice way. There's not many options left when both Kohler and Cooper are both out. And, I'm just saying, if you look at the plus minus of who was in that game and what things happened. And if you watched that game on Saturday, I don't think we need to talk anymore about it. But, ultimately at this point, like, Tom has been Big Ten Coach of the Year. He's beat Bobby Knight's record this year. He just beat the record for the most consecutive NCAA tournaments for one coach at one school. Like, Tom has proven himself over and over and over again. And so I'm not going to insert myself and say, hey, I know better than Izzo. I think there's going to be minutes that we're going to still see some of those players play. And, we have to ultimately trust that Tom can see things in these guys. He lives with them. You can just see the care that he has for them. And I know Tom well enough from being a fan over the years that if he didn't think that there was worth in that player still being on the court, that player wouldn't still be on the court.
Yeah.
And ultimately that may have contributed to a loss on Saturday, but I'm hoping that can spur these guys into, again, like I said, tightening things up, giving that extra boost of motivation that maybe a certain player needs to feel more than others, and really make them hungry coming into this week.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of talked about Michigan State this past weekend. Let's spend the last couple minutes of the episode looking specifically at the game on Friday against Bryant.
We talked about the Iowa game being a trap game, right?
Yeah.
Like, Big Ten title already secured at that moment. We're going on the road. You've got Michigan at home. Like, we talked about this, right? Like, it's this moment where it's going to be really easy to get caught looking ahead. And I think this no-name Bryant that, quite frankly, I've never heard of. It doesn't sound like Dr. Green and White had ever heard of. I don't think you've ever heard of, out of, little Providence, Rhode Island. I think it's going to be really easy, especially when you start looking at the whole bracket and looking ahead. Like, what do you think? Do you think it has the potential to be a trap game? How do you think as a team they go in? Because you're not just prepping for Friday, especially when you're playing Friday night 10 p.m. game. It's not like you're playing Friday at noon and then got more time to review film, to get ready for maybe a midday Sunday game. You're losing, half of a day to be able to prep.
Right.
How much do you think that impacts? Like, let's obviously talk about Bryant, but how much do you think this game can be something that Michigan State could potentially overlook?
Yeah, I think as far as the time goes, I think two things. Michigan State has already had a West Coast trip this year. So that routine of kind of playing in late at night at odd times, even though they're playing in Cleveland Eastern time zone, I think is going to be a little bit more familiar for them versus a Bryant team that hasn't had to travel out to the West Coast. And it's going to be a 10 o'clock game for Bryant as well. When I saw Bryant as a team Michigan State played, I had not the first idea about what kind of team
no thoughts in my mind
they were. But I think I did a little bit of research. And I think a couple of things that stood out to me when looking at this 15-2 matchup is when you look at these kind of 15 seeds or lower seeds that upset higher teams.
Yeah.
It's usually when that lower seed's strength, whether it be shooting or rebounding or defense, kind of lines up with the higher seed's weaknesses.
Okay.
When you look at Bryant, according to Bart Torvik, I know Paul Fanson talks a lot about Ken Pom, but looking at Bart Torvik, looking at their rebounding percentage, both offensively and defensively, they're pretty high in the country in both of those marks. It's been a strength of their team. They're a very tall team. I think their shortest guy that they really play is like 6'5". So they rebounded well. Really
they got over there in Providence.
Right. But for Michigan State, we know that not only this year, but rebounding is the identity of Tom Izzo coach team. When you have guys like Jackson Kohler, like Carson Cooper, when you rebound the ball so well offensively, get those second chance points, like that isn't going to be, I think, something that Bryant's going to be able to exploit in Michigan State. I think
to the same level that they've been able to with people in the American East Conference.
Well, and if you would have had Bryant against, a team that's a really poor rebounding team, that's like, hey, maybe that's something,
a big strength of theirs.
That could be a mismatch and something that they could exploit. But I don't really think that's something they're going to be able to really exploit. Another thing is, too, you see these upsets where these teams just get so hot from three. They can't miss. You look at Middle Tennessee State against Michigan State. You look at
to say their name.
Oakland versus Kentucky. Bryant isn't a very great shooting team, especially behind the arc. Granted, you never know when a team is going to get hot. But I think also because of that, it doesn't seem like they have some of the makeup for this upset. And again, anything can happen. We're not naive to the point we're saying there's no chance Michigan State is going to have a challenging game against Bryant. But I just don't necessarily see that this is a team that Michigan State is going to have a ton of issues with.
From the metrics, I'm going to push back on that just a little bit, because something that I think is really interesting about this Bryant team, again, from just very preliminary research, is that they also seem to have sort of like a strength in numbers kind of mentality. They've got 6 guys that average at least 20 minutes per game. And then they've got 8 guys that average at least 10, and 9 that average at least 9 minutes a game. So they're also a team that seems to use the depth of their bench. They also are a pretty consistent 3-point shooting team. So I believe they're, starting 5 and then 6th man have an average of at least 32% from behind the arc. And I think their top is shooting like 38%. So it's not like you've got, some guys like Shimon Zapala that who knows what his 3-point percentage is. And then you've got other guys that, are shooting a lot higher. They're all consistent 3-point shooters. And so I think them having that depth and some of that consistency could potentially be a mismatch for some teams. Now, the reason that I am not really worried about this, and I do not feel like this is a trap game, is that 1, we have Coach Izzo as our coach. And 2, these boys just lost. And these boys do not like losing. They have just won, 8 in a row prior to that? Like, this loss stings, and they are going to come out hungry. If I know anything about the DNA for this team of, us just yapping about them week in and week out since, November, October? When we did our basketball season preview, is that, they don't handle defeat well. And I think it was the real Shardy over on Blue Sky. Actually, who was replying to Matt Sheehan, who said something along the lines of, the last time Michigan State beat Oregon and then lost to a team in red, we went on an 8-0 tear. So I'm feeling that same kind of energy coming.
But I'm so excited. This is like the best week of the year. I don't think it's even close.
No.
We're going to continue to be there with you for content. I know tip-off time just got announced for 10 o'clock, but we'll see how we're feeling after the game, but I'm hoping that we can get that mini episode to you guys by Saturday morning.
Good thing we're night owls.
We're night owls, but we'll hopefully get the episode out to you Saturday morning, kind of recapping Michigan State's we're gonna say victory against Bryant, and then we'll be also reaching or coming out too with an episode on Monday as well, like we usually do. So keep on following along. keep on following along all week at Spartans Illustrated. I know there's going to be a ton of great content coming out, not only for men's basketball, but for men's hockey and women's basketball as well, just to keep you satisfied until the wee hours of Friday night when Michigan State finally tips off. But I'm excited. It's such a fun time of year. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, just, this is the glorious time in March. Soak it up, enjoy it. We were just chatting with Paul Fanson after we hung up recording of this is better than any holiday. So I hope that if you haven't already and you have the opportunity to, maybe take Thursday and Friday off of work, sit in the joy that is 12 plus hours of basketball Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I mean, it just really doesn't get better than this. And, for those of you who've been listening for a little while, that we yap all the time about how my entire family descends on one of my siblings' houses and we just eat food and watch basketball for really a full week's worth of time. And so if you're following us over on Instagram, maybe even on Blue Sky, I'm sure you'll get some behind the scenes looks of the absolute chaos that is the junk food and basketball that we consume. So definitely be just monitoring our social media. Spartans Illustrated is again going to keep you up to date with, I'm sure, a much more in-depth preview of Bryant. You're going to have some excellent information from Dr. Green and White when it comes to filling out your brackets. Tag us in your brackets as you're filling them out. We would love to be able to see that and kind of just go on this March Madness journey with you all. It's such a great time of year, and it's a great time of year to be a Spartan. So go Green,
go White, go State.